Father, we thank you so much for this time that we've had together and friendships that have formed old and new, and that you have spoken into our lives through Lewis's life and writings. And Father, I just pray that as we come to this last class time, that we can come to a satisfactory ending, but also that we would continue to think about the things that have been shared. And we ask this in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
And just a reminder that these have been recorded and that they are available on the church website under the Sunday school part. So if you want to go back or you want to recommend it to somebody, those things will be available. Eventually, they're also going to be on the CAM website. Okay. Lewis liked to turn the tables on subjects, so he wrote a really wonderful essay that was not about being critical about books, but being critical about the readers who read books and putting them into classifications. And Lewis had a real sense of humor, and he liked to do things like that. So I thought I would turn the tables here. We've been talking about Lewis on salvation or Lewis on scripture or various topics, but this is going to be Constance Rice on C.S. Lewis as we come to a conclusion. And I want to address the question, is C.S. Lewis relevant in the 21st century? And once you get to know Lewis, I think it becomes very apparent that he is, because here we are 20 some years into the 21st century, and we're still talking about Lewis and looking at his life and his ideas. But I want to make some arguments in that direction. This is a great picture of C.S. Lewis. My favorite picture of C.S. Lewis is one where he's standing and he's wearing a bathrobe, one of those heavy English bathrobes. And he did that because his rooms at Magdalen College was very cold. It's called the New Building, but it was built in 1773. But it's the newest building on the college campus. And with that, it was very cold. And so he would wear layers of clothes. And one of the things about Lewis that everybody who describes him is that he dressed very slovenly. He wore, old, kind of wrinkled clothes. Some people said he looked like a butcher, not an Oxford Don. And so he really didn't care much about fashion. And so I love that picture of him wearing a robe, greeting his students that way, just so that he could keep warm in his rooms. So I'm asking the question, can a writer from the 20th century be relevant in the 21st century? And these are some of the arguments against. And I won't be able to discuss all of them in depth, but I may stop and pause here and there. C.S. Lewis was born in 1898 and died in 1963. In some ways, he was more Victorian, having grown up in the early 1900s. And that's true of him. When he wrote his autobiography, it wasn't a tell-all. We didn't learn about his sex life when he was in college, or he didn't like to talk about those aspects of his personal life, although in The Four Loves, he talks about Eros. And so it's not that he shied away from the topic, but Victorians were much more conservative and closed about those kind of topics. He taught at Magdalen College in Oxford University, a male-dominated institution that did not admit women until 1979. And so one of the things that you see in the film Shadowlands, and Deborah Winger playing Joy Davidman, is she's, in this room filled with men. And she's a very brassy New Yorker, and they don't like her because she just, doesn't fit into that circle. And then just for a little background, that on October 7th, 1920, the first 130 women received degrees from the Divinity School at Oxford University. There are these different schools that make up Oxford University, so this is just one of those. And although by 1920 women had been studying at Oxford for decades, they could not earn degrees. Some accused Lewis of sexism in his life and writings. And if you go and do a search on the internet, you'll see some things that go along those lines that would say he was a misogynist. I would strongly disagree with that, and there's lots of really sound arguments on the other side of that statement. One that I read this week as I was preparing for class was, all you have to do is look at Lucy in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, who's the real heroine of the stories, and other characters in his stories. But that's one argument that you'll hear. Lewis was opposed the addition of literature after the 19th century to the canon of English literature. So when Lewis began teaching at Magdalen College, any literature that was from the 20th century, including T.S. Eliot, was excluded. It was not considered part of their canon of what they taught. And so some people would argue that, you know, he was very narrow in that perspective. Now later, he embraced T.S. Eliot and other contemporary writers, but that was one area. His peers at Oxford felt his public writing and speaking on Christianity was inappropriate for a professor at Oxford, and we talked about that before. Along with that, in the wave of modern theology in the 20th century, Lewis's works on theology were deemed simple and naive. What was important to Lewis was that his Christianity be orthodox, not liberal, and supernaturalist, not modern, believing in miracles, in contrast to the leading theological thought of the day, which he dubbed Christianity and water, so watered down version of Christianity. Many critics have examined Lewis's Luddite. Now, if you don't recognize Luddites are a group of laborers in England between 1811 and 1815 who was opposing the modernization of the linen mills in England. And so because they were opposing the technology of that time, they were called Luddites. And that's where we get that expression. Many critics have examined Lewis's Luddite tendencies, seeing in them a rejection of contemporary life and a mind fit only to live in a bygone age. Now Lewis did dislike a typewriter. So I don't know what he would think about computers today. He wrote everything with a nibbed pen, the kind of pen that you put into an inkwell and write out. I loved when I studied at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, when you look at his writings, it's all in this very neat, beautiful, handwritten notes and manuscripts. Later, his brother would type that into a manuscript that then went on to the publishers, but he wrote everything by hand. So that's one example of his kind of resisting the more modern technological developments. Now, I know as a professor, I learned how to type on a class in high school with typewriters. And the only way I could bring myself to face the computer was just to tell myself it was just another more sophisticated typewriter. And I had to do my master's thesis on a typewriter, so that kind of forced me into that world, but I was reluctant. And I've said many times in class, I'm not great with technology, and that's still true today. And just about the time I would get comfortable with something at the university, either in the classroom or computer in my office, then it would be upgraded, or and I'd have to start learning all over again. So all of that is very frustrating to me. So I can kind of relate to Lewis in that regards. Academic theologians saw Lewis as an intruder on their turf, a layman writing about matters that the scholar's advanced degrees certified to be off limits to the laity, and an extraordinarily popular and influential writer to boot. So that, again, this criticism from his peers, from individuals in other academic fields, particularly theology, And they just didn't think Lewis had any right to be writing about theology or Christianity or being a public speaker in that regard. Lewis's use of the fairy tale in the Chronicles of Narnia and its success brought criticism. How could a bachelor write stories for children? And again, if you've seen the Shadowlands movie, there's a scene when they're in the Eagle and Child, the pub that they frequented, and he's getting some pushback from his fellow peers about why is he writing the Chronicles of Narnia, because that, you don't have any children. But Lewis did bring in during World War II children from London with the bombing, kind of what we're seeing with the Ukrainians right now, and people in England that had lived outside of London, farther into the country, would bring children into their home and keep them during the bombing in England. So he had that interaction, and that's where you get the Pevensie children in the Chronicles of Narnia, particularly in The Magician's Nephew. We find them in their introduction to Professor Diggory, who I will talk about a little bit more today. So he thought that his use of the fairy tale, and I got pushback even at the university for teaching the Chronicles of Narnia in my C.S. Lewis class, because it was a fairy tale and it wasn't appropriate. so I understand that. I thought this was a great statement. Professor Samuel Hines, this is a critic of Lewis, in July 8, 1979, more than a decade after Lewis's death, in the issue of the New York Times Book Review, abused Lewis with the old-style invective. He called him a pudgy knight of the Round Table, always ready to do battle against the enemies of faith and not too scrupulous about how he won. A man with an irresponsible, antisocial streak who seemed to dislike both women and children and knew nothing about science except that he hated it. J.R.R. Tolkien once called Lewis every man's theologian. Professor Hines concluded his essay, every man would have been better off without him.
Wow.
So yeah, wow. Wow, so there you get that kind of pushback when you go on the internet concerning Lewis, which brings us to our question, is he relevant today in the 21st century? So in defense of C.S. Lewis, and I'm using 3 points, there's a lot more that I could say, but I'm going to talk again about his theology, a little more about the literature, and then I'll close with the imagination, which we talked about last week. Lewis's relevance today can be summarized in his own words from the preface to his best-known theological work, Mere Christianity. Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that perhaps the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief. His success in doing so during the 1940s earned him the label the apostle to the skeptics, and with justification. He tackled such perennial issues as the problem of evil and the apparent conflict between modern science and the supernatural in the problem of pain and miracles. He also managed to communicate and defend the entire gospel to a popular audience of millions in the famous wartime radio broadcast between 1941 and 1944. According to the BBC, around 50% of his listeners were unbelievers. Interesting. An extraordinary tribute to Lewis's powers of persuasion and communication. Furthermore, Mere Christianity had the published version of Lewis's radio talks, which first came out in 1952, has sold over 1 million copies worldwide and is continually in print. Now I'm using some statistics that were given by a writer, Vander Eltz, and he was putting this out in 2013, so I'm sure that there would be updated statistics in that regard. The themes and messages in Mere Christianity not only spoke to the audience during the time of publishing and distribution, but very much so to the people exploring their faith today. The reason it still speaks today is because it answers so many questions people have related to faith by offering invaluable, timeless insight in a relatable way. And that's a really simple way of explaining why Lewis works, because people can relate to him. And there's whole books that are based on why he relates to people, and part of it was that he used the language of the common people. He used analogies that people could relate to. When he was revising Mere Christianity, getting it ready for the publishing of the books, he changed some of the analogies that he had used on the BBC radio talks because he thought something else might be better. So he really thought through, how do I reach this audience that I am speaking to? And having taught communication, audience is one of the primary focus that you have to have if you're going to communicate, whether that's written or whether that is through spoken communication. Though the book has its critics, his case for Christianity still has ardent admirers today because of this reason. His communication techniques remain an invaluable model for the 21st century apologist and evangelist. And I talked last week about the book Eternity in Their Hearts that talks about how missionaries in the 21st century, the end of the 20th century, were using culture as a means by which to speak to people that didn't have a Bible or didn't have any background with Christianity, but by studying their stories, finding inroads into how to talk about the gospel. His critique of atheism, scientific materialism, and moral relativism, and that's a lot of isms there, and you may connect with them or not, remain highly relevant because the process of secularization and de-Christianization has only accelerated since his death. And that's one of the points that Pastor Goldman has been making as we've been talking about the deconstruction of our faith and now rebuilding it. Increase the proportion of atheists and agnostics within most Western societies. And I think that's a very true statement. Lewis showed that reason is the anchor of faith. By presenting a defense of the gospel, of the Christian faith that appealed to reason, Lewis removed obstacles to faith that most people in our world face today. By restoring reason to its rightful place, Lewis showed how Christianity could appeal to those earnestly seeking answers to the greatest questions of life. As Lewis noted, Christ never meant that we were to remain children in intelligence. He wanted a child's heart, but a grown-up's head. I like it. So we need both. So literature. To give a more complete account of Lewis's influence, his books have been translated into more than 30 languages. And when we were in China, we discovered that Lewis's books had been translated into Chinese, although the Chinese were not allowed to read them. But they had been translated there. The books that make up the Chronicles of Narnia, first published between 1950 and 1954, have sold the most and have been popularized on stage, TV, radio, and cinema, and estimates approach 150 million sets having been published. Now again, these statistics come from around 2013, so it would be more than that at this point. Since 2001, Mere Christianity has sold 3 million copies, and the Screwtape Letters 2 million copies. It is estimated that annual sales of Lewis's books range from 3 to 6 million copies, and that's millions and billions of dollars every year. In all, there are 110 authored or edited books by Lewis, and you heard two numbers there, 30 books by Lewis and now 110. That's because they've taken Lewis's writings and packaged them in various ways. Like you have the C.S. Lewis Bible that uses Lewis. So 110. And at last count, 242 books that discuss him and his work, with additional new ones published every year. And when I began my research on Lewis, about 30 years ago, it was like a literary black hole because there were so many books on Lewis, biographies that I needed to read, and literary criticism that I needed to read, and then you throw in J.R. Tolkien and George MacDonald and Chesterton and others. You could just read and read and read for a very long time and not get to the end of it. So that says something when you have that amount of literary criticism and biography about a single individual, about how relevant he is today. The combined box office sales for the 3 Narnia films totals $1.5 billion. Total budget was $560 million, so it made a profit. With The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, the 49th highest grossing film of all time. Now, I don't know if that would still be true today, but it was at the time that this was done. And the film series is the 24th highest grossing one of all times. Now this Harry Potter, I'm probably turned that upside down, but again, it says something. Now I did a little research because there's a 4th C.S. Lewis, The Silver Chair, is supposed to be coming out. It's in production and it's gone through several directors, and now Netflix has obtained the rights to The Silver Chair and the other Narnian books, and are planning on doing them all. And I don't know, I don't have any date as to when that's going to happen, but Netflix is pretty good at doing the productions. So there was nothing that said, 2024, but they are coming. Until the Harry Potter series, the 7 volumes of Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia book series were the most influential children's books in the world. And I love that. Almost every elementary school teacher read the Chronicles of Narnia to their students in their classroom. And they may not have known that it was a Christian author. One of my delights at the Bodleian was I got a file folder of children that had written letters to C.S. Lewis after hearing The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. And it was a big fat folder. They wrote them after Lewis had died, so Lewis didn't get to read them. But it was so sweet. I think there were 3rd graders, and to see how they were still interacting with Lewis's writing. It was voted so by successive polls of parents, librarians, and teachers, and by their sales. And the Potter books haven't cut into Narnia's market. Indeed, they're greatly expanded it as sales of the Narniad, another way of saying the Chronicles, have increased by 20% during this time. And one of the things that happened with the Harry Potter stories, children, as you know, just mowed through them, read them, and then they wanted something more. And the librarians and teachers said, well, here's the Chronicles of Narnia. And so it added in with the success of the Harry Potter stories. His canon, in addition to hundreds of essays and short writings, consists of more than 30 books. And again, how you count that varies. Some say 35. It just depends on how it's packaged. Like the 3 BBC talks that he did, that the 3 of them make up Mere Christianity, but first they were published individually, so it's kind of hard to figure it out. And Lewis's stories seem just as comfortable in Hollywood as they are in a corner bookstore. In recent years, 3 stories of the Chronicles of Narnia appeared as major film adaptations, with a 4th in development. And other films based on his life and works have materialized too, such as Shadowlands, which cast Anthony Hopkins as Lewis and tells the story of his marriage to Joy Davidman, and the recent bio, The Most Reluctant Convert. And if you haven't seen that, I recommend it, and it's still out there. and a forthcoming film version of The Great Divorce, which has been a stage play and is very close to, it's in production at this point. There are multiple stage plays based on his life and writing as well. Lewis's narratives both answer intellectual questions and satisfy spiritual longings. He demonstrates the importance of images and stories without forgetting the necessity of reasoned, coherent belief. Lewis helped Tolkien finish perhaps the best work of literature from the century, and many lists, like the Times list of the 100 most important books of the 20th century, The Lord of the Rings was number one. So The Lord of the Rings, another biographer, Alistair McGrath, suggests that Harry Potter series is a kind of homage to the Narnian stories, and there's been quite a bit of research on that and comparison, and many have said the fact that J.K. Rowling made 7 books for the Potter series was a homage to Lewis's 7 books in the Chronicles of Narnia. One of the few men who attended Lewis's funeral was the English theologian and philosopher Austin Farrer. Now keep in mind that Lewis died the same day that John F. Kennedy and Alex Huxley died, and he kind of got pushed aside as far as the news stream, and it was not announced in general, so there was just a small group of individuals that were at his funeral, and Farrer, who was a very good friend of Lewis, was one of those. In his eulogy that day, Farrer effectively described the combination of logic and emotion, of fact and imagination, of prose and poetry that made Lewis's writings resonate with many demographics of readers. In other words, readers found and still find that Lewis's narratives both answer intellectual questions and satisfy spiritual longings. There's the left brain and the right brain. Lewis demonstrates the importance of images and stories for the life of faith, without forgetting the necessity of reasoned, coherent belief as well. In a culture that views the world more as charcoal than black and white, Lewis's vision of the world speaks to a whole new mind of the 21st century as well as his native 20th. This vision for a Christian lens to the world permeates Lewis's stories. Because for him, the best stories hinted at the deep structures of reality, helping humanity in the journey for truth and significance. Good stories point to an ultimate story. And as Farrer, but few else might have predicted, Lewis appears more relevant today than ever. Imagination, and this part will be short, because we just talked about it last week. For Lewis, unsuccessful as a poet, and originally Lewis wanted to be a poet, and he wrote, before he was a Christian, several long narrative poems that were published but weren't very successful. He continued to write poetry, and you can look at his poetry, his Christian poetry as well, but it just wasn't like his other writing. So he found that the best vehicle for conveying the mythic aspects of Christianity was fiction. Science fiction and fantasy in particular, because these could be combined with the supernatural appeal. Now, I haven't had a chance to talk much about the sci-fi series, 3 books. If you don't like science fiction, it may not be your cup of tea. But I love science fiction, and I have really enjoyed these and have read them multiple times. Dan and I have read them out loud together. But Perelandra, if you have to pick one, is my favorite. And for example, it contains a 100-page temptation story. So if you want to understand about the temptation that takes place in the garden in the book of Genesis, so short in those few chapters, he takes 100 pages to develop this. It's set on a different planet, which he calls it Perelandra. It would be Venus. It's a land of water, and with a different Eve. The Chronicles was a reimagining of the Christian story. He asked the question, Lewis, what might Christ be like if there really was a world like Narnia? And he chose to be incarnate and die and rise again in that world as he actually had done in ours? That was kind of his beginning question. Lewis's view of importance and function of fairy tales, they can be evangelistically effective by baptizing the imagination and presenting the theological truths in fresh and novel settings. This is particularly important in a postmodern culture in which storytelling is given so much prominence as a vehicle of communication. And that is so true about the 21st century. And I know with our grandchildren that range from 2 years old to 20, but the middle are in their teens or just going into teens, they're all about gaming and fantasy and books that are in those genres. And that's very much where that generation is thriving. And we need to speak into that generation. And one way we can do it is through the telling of stories. Although Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia are not in the strict sense Christian allegories, they do include, and when I say that Aslan is a figure like Christ, but he is not Christ. He doesn't do everything that Christ did, but there are similarities between the two, or it's a technical literary kind of definition. They do include the following themes, Christian themes. Creation, in The Magician's Nephew, I read a little bit of that last week. Atonement, the lion, the witch, and the wardrobe. Resurrection, the same, and also the silver chair in The Last Battle. The final book of the Narnian tales, The Last Battle, also includes the themes of the second coming and the last judgment, and conveys Lewis's now famous contrast between life in the Shadowlands, our fallen world, and true life and real waking awaiting us in our true country of heaven. I'm going to read from that in just a moment. Lewis noted that reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. The concept of story or narrative was crucial for Lewis. He showed that Christian imagination could expand our senses of what's possible. Christian imagination could re-enchant a world that has been disenchanted by the limited possibilities of modernism and scientism. And if you read the Magician's Nephew, what is it? The story with the prince. The silver chair, no?
Caspian.
Caspian, thank you, Caspian, just fell out of my brain. It's over there on the floor. Caspian deals with that, a Narnia that has been, all of the magical creatures have been driven into the woods and have been imprisoned. And Caspian is about the re-enchantment of Narnia. And that's such a picture of what we need to do in the 21st century. So that's a good book to look at. By the limited possibilities of modernism and scientism, he showed that speaking about God in non-religious terms is vital, making the truths of Christianity fresh and unique. And this is a final quote from Lewis. I do not think the resemblance between the Christian and the merely imaginative experience is accidental. I think that all things in their own way reflect heavenly truth, the imagination not least. Reflect is the important word. This lower life of the imagination is not a beginning of, not a step toward, the higher life of the spirit, merely an image. And so, now I'm going to read from The Last Battle. It's big, this has all of the books, and it's very heavy. In the Last Battle, it tells the story of how Narnia comes to an end, which is, you want to say like Lucy did when Aslan told her that she couldn't come to Narnia anymore. It's like, oh no. And our youngest daughter, who is an avid reader, she would not read the last book for months. She had plowed through the first 6, but she was not going to read that last book because she did not want to come to the end of the series. And I think sometimes that's how we feel. It's also Lewis's imaginative way of looking at eschatology. So if you're interested in end-time events, it's so imaginative and so wonderful. But I'm going to try to lean this here and not drop it. Okay, so all of the children and other characters have found themselves in Aslan's country, but they're not quite sure what that means. And then they meet Professor Diggory, who's from The Magician's Nephew, and also in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. We find him there, and he starts to explain what it is that they're seeing. "The eagle is right," said Lord Diggory. "Listen, Peter, when Aslan said you could never go back to Narnia, he meant the Narnia you were thinking of. But that was not the real Narnia. That had a beginning and an end. It was only a shadow of or a copy of the real Narnia, which has always been here and always will be here, just as our own world. England and all is only a shadow or copy of something in Aslan's real world. You need not mourn over Narnia, Lucy. All of the old Narnia that mattered, all the dear creatures have been drawn into the real Narnia through the door with a capital D. And of course, it is different as a real thing is from a shadow, or as waking life is from a dream." His voice stirred everyone like a trumpet as he spoke these words. But when he added under his breath, "It's all in Plato. All in Plato. Bless me, what do they teach them at these schools?" And Lewis was very much about Plato. The older one laughed. It was so exactly like the sort of thing they had heard him say long ago in that other world where his beard was gray instead of golden. He knew why they were laughing and joined in the laugh himself. But very quickly, they all became grave again. For as you know, there is a kind of happiness and wonder that makes you serious. It is too good to waste on jokes. Jokes. It is hard to explain how this sunlit land was different from the old Narnia, as it would be to tell you how the fruits of that country taste. Perhaps you will get some idea of it if you think like this. You may have been in a room in which there was a window that looked out on a lovely bay of the sea or a green valley that wound away among mountains. And in the wall of that room, opposite to the window, there may have been a looking glass. And as you turned away from the window, you suddenly caught sight of that sea or that valley all over again in the looking glass. And the sea in the mirror, or the valley in the mirror, were in one sense just the same as the real ones, yet all the same time they were somehow different, deeper, more wonderful, more like places in a story you have never heard but very much want to know. The difference between the old Narnia and the new Narnia was like that. The new one was a deeper country. Every rock and flower and blade of grass looked as if it meant more. I can't describe it any better than that. If you ever get there, you will know what I mean. It was the unicorn who summed up what everyone was feeling. He stamped his right forefoot on the ground and neighed, and then cried, "I have come home at last. This is my real country. I belong here. This is the land I have been looking for all my life, though I never knew it till now." The reason why we love the old Narnia is that it sometimes looked a little like this. Bree, hee, hee, come further up, come further in. So my ending is not the end, but further up and further in. Thank you. Well, we've got a little time for any questions or comments, anything you might like to share in regards to the class. We're actually ending just a few minutes early. That clock is still 4 minutes fast. No questions? I've stunned you into speechlessness.
I
This
was
is
just
like a
thinking that last piece that you were reading there is very much like, you know, we are in reality in this world, and heaven is kind of a mystery to us, but maybe the real reality is heaven. We just haven't gotten there yet.
And that's why Lewis calls this world the Shadowlands.
Yeah, right.
This is just a shadow of what there is in heaven, and that's a Platonic kind of idea, but I think a very Christian kind of idea. And so we get all hung up on this world and forget that we're pilgrims, forget that this world points us to another world and to eternity. And this life is not what it's all, you know, is the only thing that our lives are about. And so many people in the 21st century think this is it. You know, I'll live this life and I'll do the best that I can, and when I die, there's nothing else beyond that. And that's why the gospel is so important, that we find ways to communicate it and to communicate it effectively, because there's a world out there that doesn't know. Yes?
I love this idea of imagination, and especially as a spiritual exercise, because if you are unable to imagine, you struggle with even intercessory prayer, because you can't imagine how things can be different than they are. And if you struggle with imagination, you struggle with discipleship, because you can't imagine yourself or others in a way that they're not currently behaving. So I think we probably should be talking a little bit more about imagination, maybe a little bit less about what would be the word, precepts, or something like that.
Yes. You were sharing that imagination, we need more of it, because it helps us in our prayer life, it helps us in evangelism, helps us to kind of, as Paul said, you know, you become everyone, you know, in order to communicate the gospel. So yes, it is a very important topic. I spend a lot of time with children under the age of 5, and I do that deliberately because I love seeing the world through their eyes, and it helps me to remember what it is to be childlike and imaginative in my play. You know, so a train is not just a train, you know, it's a real train, and you can drive it, you know, and you can, I just spent a week with my 2-year-old grandson, and I'm a little tired, but it's wonderful. I love spending time with children for that reason, and read books, you know, that set your imagination on fire. They don't have to necessarily be Christian books, but they will, Lewis will say everything is going to lead you to the truth. What I call the truth with a capital T. You cannot miss it if you are seeking God. Pierre.
Yes, one comment and 2 questions. My comment is about, you ask if there is anything that we would like, you know, further up from this class, and I vote for Mere Christianity. Why? Because I think it will be a tool for us trying to get new non-believers into Christianity, and further understanding and how to use that as a tool will be very helpful.
Okay.
So that's what I vote for.
Okay, Mere Christianity class focused on that.
And question 1, you mentioned about doing your thesis on C.S. Lewis, right?
No.
No?
My doctoral work was on C.S. Lewis.
Okay. So any insight on what it was about, you know, and what you got out of it, you know, or that you can share.
Well, I was able to spend 2 summers in Oxford and to go to Lewis's home. Had a group of high school students that came through Oxford that I walked them through all the places to see and talked to most of the people that knew Lewis have passed at this point. But I was able to speak with a number of people that knew Lewis and had spent time with him. That was very valuable. Looking at his original manuscripts was moving to me. And again, I spent hours and hours in the library, which I'm a real geek. I love doing that. Libraries are one of my favorite places to be. And it just kind of, and then I've been to the Wade Center as part of it at Wheaton College. And it just helped me to begin to see Lewis in a fuller, more in-depth, you know, like he might have been 2-dimensional and he became 3-dimensional, maybe even 4-dimensional. I really feel like, it's funny because I still call him Lewis or I call him C.S. Lewis. His friends called him Jack, but I don't feel comfortable calling him Jack. Okay, and we're out of time, but do you have one more question just real quick, or?
Who do you think is the C.S. Lewis of today? Any new writers you follow?
That was one of the things, I don't know that there is one. We're looking for one, and it could still happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
I will miss all of you.